This is a loop, like a magnifying glass. And through this, I'm going to show you that this book and all the other books that you may have are made up of dots. The materials that commercial presses print fall into two basic categories. They are line art or copy and continuous tone copy. In the printing industry, copy refers to anything that has to be reproduced. Although in the local industry, copy exclusively means text, it actually means type, photographs, illustrations, etc. Line copy or line art refers to anything that doesn't involve any tonal gradation and is meant to be printed in a single color requiring no intermediate treatment. So images such as engravings, images, pen and ink art, and of course text. Continuous tone, on the other hand, refers to images or even text that have gradations and tones. So that includes pencil drawings, paintings, and photographs. One thing you have to understand about printing: a printing press cannot reproduce an artwork exactly. It can only print solid areas of ink, meaning either the surface of the paper will have ink or no ink. That's not a problem with line copy, wherein you only have solid areas of ink. But what about an artwork like this, with subtle gradations and value changes? Well, the artwork has to undergo an intermediate treatment that will allow it to be printed in a printing press. It has to be converted into what we call a halftone. So here are photographs from inside the book I showed you a while ago. So as you can see, the photographs are made out of dots. You can clearly see that there's a dot pattern going on in the photographs. And all the images have to be converted this way so they can be printed. So a photograph or artwork that contains tonal values must be converted into a halftone before it can be printed. And this process of halftoning involves converting the image into a pattern of dots to simulate its continuous tones. So an image such as this, when printed, becomes something like this. The continuous tone image is converted into a pattern of dots. In the old days, the halftoning process was completely analog. Operators used the process camera to take a photo of whatever image that you wanted to reproduce. A light will then be projected onto the original negative, with the light passing through a halftone screen. The resulting duplicate negative will now be composed of halftone dots.
Now let's take a closer look at the halftone screen, the very heart of photo engraving. A halftone screen consists of parallel etched lines on two glass plates. The plates are cemented so that the lines cross at right angles, thus producing transparent square apertures between the intersecting lines, and they are bound together by a metal frame. The screens vary from 50 to 200 lines per square inch. Coarser screens are used for newspaper printing, the fine screens for printing on enamel paper. A screen that is 50 lines to the inch, like the greatly magnified section we see here, is so coarse that the magnified lines are easily visible.
Nowadays, halftone screens are created by the printer software, called a raster image processor, or RIP. Most suppliers of RIPs use their own halftone screening technique, which means that the halftone dots are built up in different ways depending on which RIP is used. Halftone dots come in different shapes and sizes, not just round ones, and the kind of dot pattern depends on what kind of image you want to reproduce. For example, round dots cover the greatest surface area. Elliptical dots are good for portraits that require smooth tonal variations. And square ones are best for images that require high contrast, such as images of jewelry. Halftone screens are measured in lines per inch, or LPI. LPI refers to screen frequency, which basically describes how close the halftone dots are. The higher the number of lines per inch, the finer the dot pattern, and the better the quality of the reproduction. LPI also means that the more lines per inch an image has, the more dense the ink will be. Now, these dots don't stay the same size when they're printed. They actually grow and spread on the paper. This is called dot gain and is measured in percent. Here's an extreme close-up of dot gain on paper. This means that the density of the dots, or the LPI, is also dependent on the kind of paper stock you intend to print in, because not all paper stocks absorb ink the same way. Newspapers, for example, use cheap, rough paper. Ink is prone to spread. Too fine a dot pattern for the image will darken the image too much and cause the details to merge. Here's an extreme close-up of ink printed on uncoated versus coated paper. Notice how coarse the print looks on uncoated paper versus coated paper. Although LPI is a resolution used by printing presses, it's useful to understand their definition and their place in the broader practice of graphic design and print production. So for printed materials that use cheaper, coarser paper, ink is printed less densely, which means less lines per inch, while materials printed in higher quality stock use higher lines per inch. Typically, newspapers are printed at around 65 LPI, while a good quality project will be around 150 to 170 LPI. Since we're on the topic of resolution, let's talk about other resolution terms you'll be coming across. So we have LPI, and we also have PPI and DPI. Although LPI is something more relevant to printing presses, this measure has direct correlation to the other resolution units. PPI, or pixels per inch, is often confused with DPI, but they're different. PPI is a measure of pixel density and is a screen-based resolution. PPI affects the quality of your image file. Let's take a look at these two images. The one on the left is 5.5 by 8.5 inches at 72 PPI. The one on the right is at the same size but at 300 PPI. Note the difference in how sharpness correlates with pixel density. When people usually specify DPI, what they really mean is PPI, because DPI, or dots per inch, is a property of your image. It's a physical measurement. It's the resolution of the image once it's printed on paper. Here's a close-up of the actual printed image. No pixels, just dots. What does this mean for you? Well, if you're printing something, your file's PPI must be at least double the lines per inch. So for example, if you want to print a poster or a book cover using offset printing, the usual lines per inch is around 150 to 175 LPI. That means that your image file has to be at least 300 PPI at the actual size of the material. This is where the rule of thumb of 300 PPI for higher resolution files comes from. The connection between PPI, LPI, and DPI. So once again, a digital image should have a PPI of at least double the screen frequency. And when you go to print the page on a printing press, a DPI of at least 10 times as large as the screen frequency is required. So for example, an output that requires 150 LPI, you need a 300 PPI file. When the printer outputs the file, it will use 1500 DPI. So for our immediate purposes, the only factor you can control here is your file resolution. LPI and DPI are resolutions for the printing press and will be dictated by the nature of the output material. Files for sharing over the net or for viewing usually hover around 72 to 150 PPI. Line art, on the other hand, should be scanned at 600 PPI minimum in grayscale or black and white, while continuous tone images should be at 300 PPI and above for high resolution files. Ultimately, it just means that you have to save or create your image in the highest resolution possible to give yourself greater flexibility for a variety of uses. In the end, it's always best to consult with your service provider because they'll be the ones doing the actual printing.